For over 100 years, Tokyo Station has served as the gateway to the greater Tokyo metropolitan area. But Tokyo Station is not just one of Tokyo's largest transit hubs, it is also a major tourist and shopping destination in its own right. Underneath the station is a virtual city, offering an impressive array of retail goods, souvenirs, and foods from across Japan. Little wonder 500,000 people pass through the station on a daily basis. But there is another Tokyo Station, one where you might observe strange creatures, ghosts, or shadowy figures, or apparitions from another time. Glimpses of a dark reflection from a turbulent and violent past. Tonight we'll discuss some of these ghostly phenomena said to haunt the station, along with other odd stories and experiences that defy belief. Tonight on Ghostly Japan. Ekiben, Tokyo Ramen Street, limited time pop-up stores, souvenir shops with goods from all across Japan, Daimaru department store, Grand Sta shopping mall, restaurants and shopping and restaurants, a hotel inside the station. What's not to love? Well, other than the crowds that can sometimes leave one feeling like you're packed in like sardines or claustrophobic, and a station layout that, to first-time visitors, has been called maze-like. Given just how crowded and lively it can be, it wouldn't seem like the typical setting for paranormal or creepy encounters, and yet there is quite a history of just that sort of thing. While the vast majority of paranormal stories involving Tokyo Station are in regards to ghosts, there are also other stories that aren't as easily categorized, one of which even includes a report of a cryptid. In tonight's episode, we'll discuss these strange encounters and more. First, we'll start with what is undoubtedly Tokyo Station's most famous and well-known ghost. Inside the southern dome on the Marunouchi side, near the Marunouchi South exit, it is claimed that in the early morning hours, when few people are around, the ghost of an elderly gentleman is said to appear, startling weary travelers. What's even more surprising is the identity of this ghost, for this isn't just any random ghost. This is the ghost of former Prime Minister Hara Takashi. On November 4th, 1921 at 7:10 p.m., Prime Minister Hara arrived at Tokyo Station to board a train bound for Kyoto, as there was a political convention he was due to attend. As crowds of people began to form around the Prime Minister, at 7:25 p.m., a man by the name of Nakaoka Konichi, a rail switchman from Otsuka Station, suddenly rushed Prime Minister Hara with a tanto in hand and stabbed the Prime Minister through the chest. Nakaoka was immediately swarmed by police and other onlookers as the Prime Minister, unresponsive, was rushed to the station master's office. In the station master's office, it was discovered the Prime Minister was dead. The exact spot the attack occurred at is marked by a special marker and descriptive plaque in the South Dome, the same spot the ghost of the Prime Minister is said to appear in. Prime Minister Hara took office on September 29, 1918, during a period that would later be described as the Taisho democracy by Japanese political science professor Shinobu Seizabuda in 1954. The term is meant to describe a period of time between the tumultuous transition of the Meiji period and the militant imperialism of the early Showa period. During the so-called Taisho democracy, movements to embrace democratic, progressive, liberal ideals were promoted by various political and social groups in Japan. When Hara's assassin Nakaoka was interrogated as to why he had killed the Prime Minister, he claimed that it was because he believed Hara's government was corrupt and in the pocket of the Zaibatsu. Additionally, Hara's opposition to the universal suffrage law and his handling of the Nikolaevsk massacre were cited as reasons. Nakaoka's boss was also very critical of the Prime Minister, and it seems his opinions may have rubbed off on Nakaoka. Universal male suffrage was one of the main issues of the day when Hara took office. The Meiji Restoration, which occurred in 1868, and the Constitution of the Empire of Japan, which was adopted in 1890, gave the right to vote to the Japanese people, but it was limited to men over the age of 25 who paid 15 yen annually in taxes, which was a substantial amount in 1890. Thus, at the time of adoption, only about 1% of the population was eligible to vote. By the time Hara took office in 1918, the movement was one of, if not the leading issue. Supporters of the suffrage movement were initially hopeful that under Hara's administration the universal suffrage law would be signed. After all, Hara was seen as a moderate and had even expressed that he wasn't opposed to the suffrage movement. His financial support of a women's suffrage group, an idea which was not nearly as popular at the time, was seen as further evidence that he would support the bill. However, when the time came, he declined to support them. He claimed he was open to the idea in principle, but did not feel the time was right. His failure to support efforts to pass the universal suffrage bill caused many on the left to sour on him. The era of the Taisho democracy was not as peaceful as the name might suggest. Political violence, riots, and Japan's participation in World War I and the Siberian intervention also defined the era. And in Korea, which had been annexed by Japan since 1910, Hara's predecessor had brutally put down the March 1st movement, which was a Korean independence protest against the Japanese occupation. When Hara took office, believing the harsh military rule of Korea to be counterproductive to integrating Korea into the Japanese Empire, he ordered for a switch from a military colonial government to one staffed predominantly by civilians. Additionally, he allowed for limited local Korean self-government and for allowing the Korean language and its history to be taught in schools on the peninsula, something which had been banned up to that point. These moves won Hara very little support among Koreans, as ultimately Hara still supported Japanese dominion over Korea. What this did accomplish, however, was earning Hara the ire of the Japanese nationalists, who viewed his changes as excessive and traitorous. The Nikolaevsk massacre occurred in March of 1920. Nikolaevsk was a town at the mouth of the Amur River in Siberia and had been occupied by Japan. Japan had sent some 70,000 troops into the Russian Far East as part of the Allied intervention into Far East Russia to rescue the Czech Legion and support the White Russian forces following Russia's October Revolution and subsequent peace with the Central Powers during World War I. In March of 1920, the town of Nikolaevsk had a roughly 400-man Japanese garrison, 350 or so soldiers from the Imperial Japanese Army, and a detachment of sailors from the Imperial Navy manning a long-range radio station outside of town. There were also roughly 300 White Russia troops in the town. During the winter months, the town was cut off from the sea due to sea ice, making the radio station the only communication link with the outside world. Roughly 4,000 Bolshevik guerrillas composed of Russian, Chinese, and Korean fighters, many of whom had been recruited from liberated penal camps, arrived outside of the town in early March. They first took out the radio station, but not before the Japanese sailors were able to get out a message that they were under attack. Then the guerrillas sent a demand to town that they be allowed in and the White Russian troops disarm. They would allow for the Russian garrison's weapons to be turned over to the Japanese, who would also be allowed to remain armed and in garrison. They also promised no retribution or violence would be taken against persons or property in the town. The civilian government of Nikolaevsk was in favor of accepting the demands, while the White Russian garrison commander was against surrendering. He believed the Reds would immediately go back on their word once they had disarmed. The deciding vote was left to the Japanese garrison commander, who eventually decided to agree to the Bolshevik forces' demands. It turned out the White Russian commander was correct. Shortly after entering the town, the Red guerrillas began carrying out reprisals against those they deemed to be counter-revolutionaries. A new demand was delivered to the Japanese garrison. The Reds demanded the Japanese troops disarm and surrender. The Japanese commander, no longer believing the Reds could be trusted, decided to strike first. The fight was fierce, but lasted only a day. The Japanese forces were annihilated, and the Japanese consulate and all civilians within were set on fire and destroyed. Japanese command had received the last radio transmission from the Navy radio station, but their forces in the area were stretched too thin, and a reaction force could not be mustered locally in time. Japanese reinforcements would eventually need to be brought in from Hokkaido. The Japanese Navy responded by sending the Mikasa, a battleship, and the Mishima, a converted icebreaker, to intervene, but the sea ice was too thick for the Mishima to break through, and they were unable to make it to Nikolaevsk. Over the next several months, the Red Army in Nikolaevsk would kill an estimated 6,000 people, including around 700 Japanese. When it was all over, nearly half of the population of the town would be dead. The massacre was a massive embarrassment for the Hara administration. The inability of the Japanese military to stop the killing of Japanese civilians enraged the Japanese public. With the coming of spring, Japanese troops would launch a massive offensive and push the Reds back, but it was too late for those in Nikolaevsk. As a footnote, the command staff of the Bolshevik guerrillas that committed the massacre would be arrested and executed by Soviet authorities in July of 1920, officially executed for being traitors to the Soviet power. This was allegedly done by the fledgling Soviet government in an attempt to placate the Japanese and forestall any retribution. It didn't work, as Japan occupied northern Sakhalin Island in response and did not leave until 1925. Getting back to Tokyo Station, we have our second ghost sighting. Another well-known case, although seemingly not quite as frequently mentioned as Hara's ghost. This ghost is reportedly seen on Platform 10 in the early morning hours. The apparition of a bespectacled Japanese elder in a suit. The ghost of Prime Minister Hamaguchi Osachi. Yes, Tokyo Station has the dubious distinction of being the site of not one, but two assassinations of Japanese prime ministers. On the morning of November 14, 1930, Prime Minister Hamaguchi arrived at Tokyo Station to board the 9 a.m. train for Kobe as he was to attend the review of an army exercise down south. At 8:58 a.m., while walking on Platform 4, today this is Platform 10, he was approached by Sagoya Tomeo, a member of a far-right political group, who shot him at close range. Sagoya was immediately apprehended and Prime Minister Hamaguchi was escorted to the station master's office. Hamaguchi would then be transferred to a hospital for emergency surgery. He would recover initially, but the assassin's bullet had struck his pelvis, and he would suffer chronic recurring infections. Despite multiple surgical interventions, he would eventually succumb to his wounds on August 26, 1931. The reason Sagoya gave for the assassination was a cryptic response that Hamaguchi had caused the nation anxiety and fear. He also said Hamaguchi had violated the emperor's supreme authority and was surprised that anyone would even question why he had done it, as if the reasons were self-evident. When asked by authorities to elaborate on what he meant by violating the emperor's supreme authority, Sagoya either couldn't or wouldn't articulate his reasoning any further. If you're wondering why the Japanese didn't take steps to protect the prime minister after Hara's assassination, the answer is they did. After Hara's death, they instituted a policy of shutting down access to regular folk of the part of the station the prime minister was in. However, Prime Minister Hamaguchi, not wanting to inconvenience the common citizen, had declined this protective measure. Prime Minister Hamaguchi had taken office on July 2, 1929. The Great Depression started shortly afterwards and dominated his time in office. Japan had still been recovering economically from the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake, and when the Great Depression hit, the economic problems just compounded. Hamaguchi instituted austerity measures to combat these economic woes, policies that did not make him particularly popular among the electorate. Additionally, he had made himself the enemy of the right-wingers when, as part of these austerity measures, he cut the military budget. This animosity was exacerbated when he supported ratifying the 1930 London Naval Treaty. Right-wing politicians criticized Hamaguchi as being too deferential to the Western powers. Inside Tokyo Station, there is a plaque and marker for the location that Hamaguchi was shot at, located on the first floor near the North Transfer Gate for the Shinkansen. This location is supposed to be exactly underneath the spot on Platform 10 where he was shot. Presumably, they did not want to place the plaque on Platform 10 as it is still in use today. Both Hara and Hamaguchi had found themselves out of favor with the military and right-wing politicians before their deaths. There is a conspiracy theory that the assassinations were actually orchestrated by their political rivals on the far right. Providing fodder for this theory is what became of the two assassins after they were apprehended. Hara's assassin, Nakooka, was sentenced to life in prison, despite the prosecution asking for the death penalty. The trial was also unexpectedly quick, and records of the court proceedings subsequently were lost. Afterwards, Nakooka's sentence was reduced 3 times for good behavior, until he was released on parole in 1934. Opponents of this theory also point out that after his release, he was conscripted for service in the army, and despite being a high school dropout, he was assigned to military headquarters in Harbin, a relatively cushy, safe job far from the fighting. And despite Japan's worsening situation in the latter years of the war, he was never transferred out to the front, either a stroke of luck or evidence of powerful benefactors. During Nakaoka's time in Manchuria, he would become fascinated by Tartar culture, converting to Islam himself in 1937 and marrying a local woman in 1941. After the war, he and his wife would move back to Japan, where he would live an uneventful life until passing in 1980 at the age of 77. Hamaguchi's assassin, Sagoya, was convicted and sentenced to death. However, after just a year, his sentence was converted to a life sentence. Then, in 1940, he would be released on parole. After his release, he went back to his involvement with far-right political groups. And after the war, he would be banned by authorities from holding public office because of said connections to those groups. However, this did not deter him from continuing his activism for far-right causes. He would eventually become chairman of the largest far-right political group in Japan in 1959, a group which still exists and operates today. Sagoya would die in 1972 from cirrhosis. Despite the rather rosy-sounding impression of Taisho democracy, the assassinations of Prime Ministers Hara and Hamaguchi were not isolated incidents. The Taisho democracy, as it's been called, was a period also marred by political violence, Japanese imperialism, and civil unrest, all things that would intensify as the Taisho era ended and the Showa era began, with dark storm clouds of the Second World War gathering on the horizon, spelling a terrible omen for Japan's neighbors, and ultimately for the Japanese people as well. Before moving on to the other ghost stories in Tokyo Station, there is something a bit odd about the alleged ghost sighting of the two prime ministers that I came across in the research for this video. While I stand by the statement that these are the two most well-known ghost stories of Tokyo Station, there seems to be an odd disconnect. When looking at books, journals, websites, blogs, and other media covering the paranormal, that is to say secondary sources, if you will, sources that are aggregating, the stories of the Prime Minister's ghosts are always mentioned, without fail. In some sources only Hara is mentioned, though. However, when I look at the websites or forums where I usually find people sharing their first-hand encounters with the paranormal, that is to say personal stories, I couldn't find a single report from someone claiming to have seen these ghosts. The closest I could come was in the comment sections of some of those secondary aggregating websites, where I found a few comments where someone would post something to the effect of, "Oh, that makes sense, that's why I always got a bad feeling when I would pass by that spot," or something similar. Of course, it's possible I just missed the first-hand accounts, maybe they're out there somewhere, but it's something that struck me as odd. For such a well-known ghost, there doesn't appear to be any claims of sightings being made. For the other videos on famous haunted places I've done on this channel, I have always run into at least some first-hand claims made in the last decade or so. For the ghosts of Hara and Hamaguchi, none. At least none in the age of the internet. Make of that what you will. Having said all that, that doesn't mean that there are no paranormal phenomena being reported at Tokyo Station, quite the contrary. It's just not the ghosts of the prime ministers that are being reported. And generally, the phenomena being reported doesn't seem to be tied directly to any singular historical event. In the next section, I'll be discussing what ghostly phenomena is being reported, starting with the most common occurrences and making our way down to some of the more seldom but quite strange phenomena. Starting us off is by far the most common paranormal phenomena, and that is ghost passengers. The reports come in from across the station but seem to cluster on the platforms and for some reason in the underground passageway linking the Keio Underground to the Tokyo Station on level B1. These reports generally take the form of the reporter saying that another passenger was heading in the opposite direction walking by them, and either the other passenger bumps them or does something that causes the reporter to turn around after the passenger walks past them, only to find that no one is there. There are also variations of these reports where there is no apparition sighted, but only the sensation of being bumped into or having one's clothing or bag being tugged on. Again, when the person turns around to see who is struck them or is pulling on them, they find no one there. Another fairly common report is on the platforms, where people report seeing the figure of a World War II era Japanese soldier waiting on the platform, only to vanish right before their eyes. Similar vanishing apparitions of non-military description are also reported on the platforms. Another type of phenomena reported in this area is hearing footsteps of someone approaching, but there is no one visible. The one commonality in all of these reports is that they all seem to be either very late at night or early in the morning when the station is not quite as busy. The second most commonly reported phenomena involves a staircase on the Sobu line on level B4. The reports claim that the staircase has an otherworldly feel to it, an oppressive and ominous atmosphere, and those sharing their experience claim no one uses this staircase. Skeptics may point out that the reason for that being that most don't want to climb 4 flights of stairs, especially when there's a perfectly good escalator right next to it. But nevertheless, stories about this staircase continue to circulate. No apparitions or other phenomena are associated with the staircase, just that it has a negative atmosphere and feels like another world within the station. The next story is not a well-known one, and it is definitely not commonly reported. Having said that, though, there are multiple individuals that have alleged to have experienced this. It involves the North Marunouchi exits, and contrary to our vanishing ghosts stories, these reports almost always occur during rush hour when there are many people around. The story goes something like this. Someone who is new to Tokyo Station is lost and is trying to find their way towards the North Marunouchi exit for some reason. When they finally see the exit and then begin walking that way, something odd happens, and suddenly the individual finds themselves in a station that is virtually deserted, except for a couple of very tall, giant-like men in black suits and wearing hats who are walking through the gates up ahead. The reports seem to have a dreamlike or altered state quality to them, and once the individual passes through the gate, they suddenly find themselves back in a crowded station where everything is normal. Our last paranormal phenomena for Tokyo Station involves an event that occurred only once, but was so strange that it ended up in the newspaper. Around noon of February 10th, 1975, a group of university students were approaching the Yaesu North exit of Tokyo Station, when suddenly the ceiling tiles in front of them came crashing down, and 3 completely black monkey-like creatures about a meter in height with long tails were dangling from the exposed beams of the ceiling above them. The students were shocked and afraid and ran away to report what they'd seen. The Tokyo Station staff took the report seriously and conducted a search of the station for the strange-looking monkeys, but found only cats. During their investigation, they questioned some of the shop owners near the alleged sighting, and one coffee shop owner mentioned hearing very strange noises coming from that section of the ceiling a few months back. However, that was the extent of it. The strange black monkeys were never sighted again. Tokyo Station's official finding was that the students had run into some cats, but there are still some who believe it was something else that the students ran into back in 1975. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel for more such videos. Thanks again, and see you in the next installment of Ghostly Japan.